Welcome to MSD at Home. I think we'll make a slow start. I imagine that more participants will gradually be joining us as we enter in today's presentation and discussion. Welcome to MSD at Home, where we take you into the COVID-19 co-isolated living rooms of a number of thinkers for architecture and design. Oh, I popped out of my screen. Sorry, everyone. Here we go. My name is Hélène Frichot. I've recently joined the MSD in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning as Professor of Architecture and Philosophy and Director of the Bachelor of Design, having previously been the Director of Critical Studies in Architecture at KTH Stockholm, Sweden. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be online today. Now, before I introduce our guest for this week, Associate Professor Ana Miljački, I just want to let you know that we have a Q&A function operating on Zoom, and we will endeavour to respond to your questions following Anna's presentation. In fact, today I'm happy to be returning to questions of care, as indicated in the title of our guest. Collective care. We ventured care, repair and maintenance when I spoke to Shannon Matten in May, and today we are going to see what role care takes in producing discursive interventions in architecture. Ana Miljački, thanks for joining us today. It's around 10 p.m. where you are in Maine. Thanks for agreeing to spend some of your evening with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. You're an Associate Professor of Architecture at MIT, where you teach history, theory and design. And you're also the director of the Critical Broadcasting Lab, about which you will be speaking to us today. Obviously having a few screen sharing issues here. We met, in fact, when we joined Mireille Rodière at Taubman's College at the University of Michigan for the Raoul Wallenberg Awards. So a shout out to Mireille for the introduction. Now, at the 2014 Venice Biennale of Architecture with Eva Franch y Gilabert, now the director at the Architectural Association in London, and with Ashley Schaefer, a professor at Ohio State University, you curated the US Pavilion using the title Office US. The exhibition critically examined a century worth of the global spread of the soft power of US architecture from 1914 to 2014. This is just one amongst an impressive list of exhibitions you have been involved in curating. In 2018, you launched the Critical Broadcasting Lab at MIT, whose work Sharing Trainers was included in the Sao Paulo Architecture Biennale in the fall of 2019, where you also hosted the Collective Architecture Studio. In the spring of 2020, the lab mounted the Playroom exhibition and its Playdates at MIT. Amongst these activities, you're also the author of The Optimum Imperative, Czech Architecture for the Socialist Lifestyle, 1938 to 1968, which I believe is based on your PhD work. You're also the co-editor of Office US series of books, and you were the guest editor of Praxis 14, True Stories, and the editor with Amanda Risa Lawrence of Terms of Appropriation, Modern Architecture and Global Exchange. Your edited proceedings from the Under the Influence symposium have been recently re-released with ACTA. Today you're going to talk to us about collective care as a framing polemic for the recent work of the Critical Broadcasting Lab, its discursive interventions in architectural culture and pedagogical experimentations and oral history projects. I'm especially intrigued by your allusions to Herman Melville's character Bartleby, well known for his oft-repeated formula, "I would prefer not to," and of course for appearing as an aesthetic figure during the occupation protests. Anna, welcome. I'm going to unshare my screen and let you share yours now.
Thank you.
Here we go.
So, hello friends in Melbourne. I wish I were there with you. As a kid in my architecture high school in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, I had dreamt of going to Australia, you know, to set up home. But the story ended up making or taking a different turn. And I guess now, finally, I am here or there. And so thank you for having me and for spending this lunchtime with me. And thank you especially to Hélène Frichot for the invitation. It is an amazing historical moment that we are experiencing everywhere, and simultaneously and partly amazing because of that. And in the US, I feel we have taken up Arundhati Roy's challenge to use the pandemic as a portal to reimagining the world in the most important sense possible. And I am certain that the work of the Critical Broadcasting Lab will join forces with Black Lives Matter. But what I'm showing you here today is the lab's work before COVID, and I'm very aware of that. But this work was hopeful about instigating the changes to come that I think are necessary, and now maybe it looks like inevitable. So I have been thinking a lot recently about what it takes to care for discourse. As I launched a series of conversations on care, which have over the last 2 months migrated to a radio station started by students at MIT. And in thinking about care, I have been thinking with the theorist Shannon Mattern about maintenance with a nod to the history of the feminist celebration of the same. It, of course, takes energy to withstand the most basic forms of entropy in all spheres of life, but there are also some specific types of work necessary to undertake when tending to architectural discourse and to architecture in the contemporary moment. So even before actually launching the Critical Broadcasting Lab, which I could only finally do after receiving tenure at MIT, I have been tending to discourse, and Hélène pointed out a few of those moments. And I do think there is a kind of sisterhood of those who made a choice to invest in architectural discourse, the discipline's self-awareness and its eloquence about the role it claims in our society and culture. And I'm happy to share that sisterhood with some of you present in this Zoom space or moment. So the work of the Critical Broadcasting Lab is a kind of architectural research necessary to undertake in moments like ours, even though, and maybe especially because, it is not situated at a disciplinary center. And maybe that center has to move, and we are in the process of moving it. So I'm grateful to be able to share with you some of the recent work of the lab on tending to architectural discourse and pedagogy. There were two really important consequential projects when it came to the establishment of the lab, and I will bring them in and sort of put them on the table just so that they are available for discussion, but I won't really give them the kind of room that they each could use. The one of them was Fair and Unfair Use, which was a set of exhibitions that unfolded from a research workshop at MIT dedicated to issues of copying, authorship, and originality. And in this project, we looked beyond the relatively recent postmodern chapter to open up and establish a larger map of disciplinary engagements with the past and with its models from the past. Appropriation, we suggested in the project, was as much part of the architectural unconscious as the expectation of novelty. And we believe this was important to tackle and to think about in the moment when architectural knowledge is traveling the world at a speed that's unprecedented through various technologies now available to us. So for it, we produced over 300 historical entries for a kind of open-ended timeline along 3 different registers: register of technology, register of theoretical ideas, and legislature. That last one being the youngest of the kind of impact spheres, let's say, of these questions of originality, copying, and copyright. And so in the exhibitions, we included also a kind of a tongue-in-cheek part that we called Fair Use Moves, which were both commentary and intervention. They in fact intervene in the legal space of architecture in ways that I could describe further, but they were based on specific instances of certain tropes in architecture, which we cited, and I know you can't probably see these citations, but trust me, each of the tropes relied on specific projects. And then in the final instance of this exhibit, we also focused on the legal dimension and the way in which questions of originality have entered the court, which is generally through fairly banal sets of cases that deal with Yankee Candle, interior, federal post offices, and developer tract houses. In the final two versions of the exhibit, we really focused on the dramatic moment of the drafting of the Architectural Works Copyright Protection Act, which in the US happened in 1990, very late. And importantly for this moment, the only spokesperson for the discipline was Michael Graves. So we managed to interview him and to really sort of allow our audiences to consider what it means for that particular voice to intervene in definitions of originality in architecture. The second project, which Hélène mentioned, is Project Office US, or as Eva Frank would say, Office Us. And it was launched for the 14th Venice Biennale in Architecture, and it kept going. So last year we launched the Office US manual in New York. So hopefully that's it in a way, though our hope with this project was that it would open up venues for research for many other people who come after it. So as you might know, it was produced for the Biennale that was organized or curated by Koolhaas, and for that year he had a prompt for the national pavilions, in which he asked us all to look at the 100 years of absorbing modernism. And for us, this prompted a layered project with many moving parts and ambitions, some of which were working in alignment, others worked in kind of dialectical opposition to one another. It included many people, a research team at MIT of 25 people that I now think of as the proto-curatorial lab that I have, the critical broadcasting lab, as well as partners on the ground, storefront, and praxis. And so Hélène also introduced the three curators, but as if you know us, you know that we would probably describe this project in very different ways. For all of us, though, what was important is that since the last century has been understood for good and bad reasons to have been the American century, we felt that there was a particular burden on the US pavilion to reframe that century. Also during that century, the American architectural discourse came into its own, and certainly the architectural profession in the US rapidly materialized. So it seemed to us that, especially given Koolhaas's several proclamations about it, it was important that the curation of the pavilion come to terms with the US architectural profession's global impact. And so we chose the figure of the office to work through both content and the design of the pavilion and its operation as a kind of elemental object or subject in architecture. And so the project included a lot what we call the live office on the ground during the duration or for the duration of the Biennale. And it also included a history of the American offices and their production abroad. So we had something that we understood as repository, and I am using my mouse to show you stuff. Hopefully that's coming through. And people who had to, in a way, contend with that history as their own inherited baggage. And one could, in fact, as a visitor, look at elements that or projects and offices that we had researched, and we researched over 2,300 objects or projects. But really the point was that at any point in time, if you visited the Biennale, you would encounter the partners on the ground who would be working through that material, and you might get a very specific view at it through their eyes and through a conversation and engagement that they provided. So this is willfully a kind of a militaristic map of architectural offices, US architectural offices, landing projects across the globe. But so the key thing, the idea, at least in the MIT trench, was to address the polemic of global flattening through a kind of project in relearning to see difference, which also paradoxically starts with a form of flattening, but now within the historian's sort of vocabulary gesture. One that we thought or hoped would allow us to constitute the body of American work abroad as such. And that was important because for various reasons, architects practicing abroad don't see their work as part of this larger national operation. Generally, the smaller offices see their work as one-offs, defined by their own struggles, whereas the larger corporate firms often see the last commission only as good as the next one it might bring, such that large corporate offices like Arquitectonica couldn't date their own work for us when we were researching it. So the key for us was, and this is less important, but the key for us was that these smaller contemporary offices really sort of see themselves in this mirror that we were putting up to contemporary practice. And we were also hoping that maybe some things could infiltrate offices through our partners. So these were the two proto-critical broadcasting lab projects. But I have now launched this lab 2 years ago. And so we've been trying to do work within its own framework. And so I hope you're ready for a bit of a manifesto for the Critical Broadcasting Lab and the work that it does. There is a characteristically funny essay by George Saunders, which starts by asking us to imagine an average party. And at that party, a guy with a megaphone. Now, the story would be funny, that is, if it were not so painfully to the point about our contemporary political and informational predicament. The guy with the megaphone, fairly average to begin with, but in the possession of this technology that amplifies his statements, starts to exert social, aesthetic, and eventually political influence upon the once merry partygoers. Fairly quickly, and with just a tiny bit of coaxing, the room divides and gets meaner. Whether those partygoers liked it or not, were aware of it or not, the sheer volume and repetition of his voice insinuates his messages into their conversations, their language, their attention, and eventually their reactions. His messages get simpler and louder, simpler because louder, and vice versa. And consequently, the thoughts and feelings of those formerly curious and social partygoers follow. Their priorities and reactions are gradually rewired. This contemporary allegory, the Brain-Dead Megaphone, which I'm illustrating with William Kentridge's image, was part of an eponymous collection of essays published in 2007, working through those years, the W. Bush years in the US, and anticipating an even larger territory for multiple, similarly motivated and perhaps even shrewdly self-aware or not megaphones. Saunders dated the beginning of these stupefying media and cultural patterns back to the televising of O.J. Simpson's run across the US, citing the financial and entertainment pressures that would and continue to govern journalism, publishing, and culture with ever-increasing capability. Whether or not there was indeed such an easily figurable origin point to be found, it all just kept and keeps going. Now add to it the overwhelming and confusing effects of that which artist and writer James Bridle has more recently dubbed data overflow, along with its various concomitant symptoms: algorithmic radicalization, conspiracy theories, surveillance, radically simplified historical and nationalist narratives, plausible deniability, and the AI glitches that have caused financial crashes and evolved racist Twitter bots, hilariously dubbed artificial stupidity by the artist Hito Stierl. Conversations about architecture and cities conducted in this context can hardly avoid the fate of all other data and utterances. Distortion, simplification, inflation blink to cover up the vapor trails of meaning and of criticism and extreme specialization, all diminishing in different ways the quality of public discourse in the field. Acknowledging the complexity and inevitable implications of every reader, consumer of data, of the audiences in the above process, Saunders offered 3 essential tactics of resistance. He said, let's keep reminding ourselves that representations of the world are never the world itself. 2, turn our own megaphones down. And 3, insist that what we say through them is as precise, intelligent, and humane as possible. So, Critical Broadcasting Lab is dedicated to operating in the cultural landscape so vividly rendered by Saunders' story and in opposition to its tendencies. Its key objectives are to cultivate, seed, and multiply awareness about the media economies we inhabit, and even more importantly, the myriad contemporary and historical entanglements of architecture and politics. Its first real, or let me just say, it matters that the Critical Broadcasting Lab's home is in academia, because its role is pedagogical at MIT, providing a space of reflection carved out of a kind of a world of professional education. It also reserves a space for thinking politically and critically with an open-endedness towards the aesthetic and critical outcomes of that thinking, such that we can engage politics that don't have immediate instrumentalizable paths in design. The first sort of launching of the Critical Broadcasting Lab was through Agit Arch experiments, which were part of a larger celebration of 150 years of MIT architecture. So there were a number of different experiments happening at the same time, but Agit Arch experiments developed over 3 workshops, each sort of understandable on its own as an experiment with its own final broadcasts, yet they were interrelated through participants' own interests and which developed across the 3 episodes. And it all ended in a selection of work that we mounted into an exhibition together. So there were, each of the workshops invited guests, and you're seeing here the first set of guests, Mimi Zeiger and Anne Louis, who helped us think about dimensions of citizenship, which was the topic of their own project for the US Pavilion in Venice 2018. Then the second event took on the question of clickbait politics, sort of hacking off that, and thinking about how hashtag politics in a way work, trying to figure out if there was a way to turn some of those means and ways of working to our own ends and positions. And the last event dealt with questions of populism and the way in which architecture and design participate in those populist narratives that we now see, certainly across the US. So we worked with our interlocutors, and we started by looking at, in the citizenship part, we started by looking at a series of documents that contain our different ways of being identified. We looked at, or one of the teams looked at kinship, again, as a kind of continuation of the project that the US Pavilion had mounted in 2018. And they were producing a kind of an avatar and a persona in Instagram that attempted to sort of produce politics that would be interesting and, well, not interesting, important to sort of follow, and also politics that fit that kind of existence, the avatar, and on the internet. We worked with analogous forms through images with a designer, graphic designer, which allowed us to produce a series of books. And this one goes with the Kin project. It was titled Friend, Predator, Lover, Caretaker, Loner, Confidant, Comrade, Twin, Overlord. And it basically allowed the group that was working on kin, on real kin, to think through a set of issues that would later become the thresholds issue on kin that just got published by MIT Press. There was a project that looked at the shape of freedom. It was understood as a navigational guide for conversations about freedom or about rights, perhaps. It used depoliticized drawing of political lines to set up its arguments. So tracing the kind of edges of that which will and will not fly. It was based on depictions of US and global special trade zones, so free shipping, as you see here. But it also included sites where gambling was allowed, sites that were blocked out in Google and elsewhere. And these would be the kinds of maps that were produced in this project. There was also a look into all of the national parks and the sodomy laws in the US, different US states. So ultimately, they produced a kind of map guide and a set of GIFs that supported this in the exhibition. The exhibition that we put together, ultimately we called it Agit Arch Outpost. And it was meant to function as a kind of headquarters, political headquarters of the group that was participating in this workshop, but also as a site where research would be possible. And so it invited everyone to sort of occupy that subject position of researcher and political agitator, but for the set of causes that we felt were important. We included a membership book as a kind of commentary on various ways of being together as members, in which we collected biodata, and we promptly had to remove the book because all of our guests had left their signatures and fingerprints that could truly be used against them. So we got scared of our own broadcast. And for this, we invited, of course, people to discuss the work. And I will leave you, or the last piece of this exhibition is a video of a game that started by being called the card game, and that later we now call it identity gamble. You can play it with everything that's in your wallet, in any spot that you might find yourself. The point of the game is to collect all of the cards that define or that contain different kinds of identity. And you do that by naming the identity.
MIT card. Transportation. Ivy League.
Currency.
Mexican documents.
American visas.
Okay, I think you get the game. So the next thing I wanted to present to you is the studio that was sponsored by or sort of hosted by the Critical Broadcasting Lab, which was titled Collective Architecture Studio. And in this studio, we considered 1989, the magical year of Eastern European people, the triumph of democracy. that philosopher Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. And another philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, thought of as the year that finally placed Eastern European countries on the right path, back on track to becoming proper liberal democracies. In his views, the events of 1989 were a form of a compensatory revolution, and he wasn't the only one who saw it this way. This is the colloquial understanding of 1981. Which basically proposed that that from here on, Eastern European countries were on the right road to, well, catch up with the West. More recently, Croatian philosopher Boris Budin, one of the most important commentators on the post-socialist transitions in ex-Yugoslavian countries and elsewhere, proposed that this conception of Eastern European revolutions of 1989 as revolutions in reverse infantilized the subjects of post-socialism everywhere. It also decisively and swiftly sent all of the then freed countries straight into transitions towards global capitalism without any assessment of what their socialisms had achieved. So, and also imagining 1989 to have been in the service of Eastern Europe's catching up to the West allowed the West not to question its own historical moment and trajectory. So we were interested in the collective architecture studio of seeing things from a different perspective, from Budin's perspective. And to do that, we went to Belgrade. We were aided by the fact that Toward a Concrete Utopia had just opened at MoMA, and there was suddenly more work that was available in the realm of architecture and urbanism that we could look at. But we were interested in two key forms of collectives: the conception of self-managed group of architects, a form of common authorship that was implemented and performed through self-managed architectural enterprises on one end, and then also their charge to produce architecture for the common good. And it turned out that in engaging these topics at this moment in Belgrade, we were also joining a real movement against developer housing in the city, against the developer government, which obviously we knew we could transmit and transfer to our own context as well. So first, after studying self-management and the current state of things in the city, we produced devices that challenged and augmented our own collective. We produced an archive, protocols for working together, tools for commoning, and these sort of full-scale group interventions included reconfiguring our own workspace, a collective garment, which we wore at MIT and in Belgrade, and a game that we played here in the final event, which I will also show you, but also in Belgrade. So this was a wearable self-management game that recast the key theoretical tenets of self-management into different levels of difficulty. Everyone had to put on this game, so you would there would be 5 people playing it. You enter this sleeve in a way, and you wear it just like here. And the first level of difficulty, for example, is everyone is able to see, and they can help each other and communicate as they put balls into different halls. And the second level of difficulty includes only one person being able to see, the foreman, which is a kind of a concept in self-management. And the foreman is able to guide others in the playing of the game. So then we also intervened in the Belgrade context and around a very particular park in the city that has now seen different kinds of projections of different ideologies upon it over the last few decades. But we wanted to, and the park itself is an outcome of socialist city planning. And so we wanted to enter a discussion about it sort of preemptively, as there's a lot of things that are happening currently in the city about it. These are the things that we did before actually going to Belgrade. But in Belgrade, the Collective Architecture Studio joined, as I said, activists on behalf of the city and on behalf of the cultural memory of social ownership and this experiment, historical experiment in self-management. And they seemed to think that one of the most important things for architects to think about in this moment in the city was housing. So we engaged through their own research about various locations that were in limbo, in ownership limbo. And also their studies of different financial models that could come in here. We engaged the question. The key thing that's important about this is that before the 90s, in this context, housing and as many other things were socially owned, which is a little bit different than our sort of Western idea of social housing. But what's important right now is that in this moment of developer housing, sort of when developer housing has completely flooded the market and is the only solution, there is nothing, no provision even in the sense that we think of when we say social housing. So we produced a series of sort of architectural pattern books that included financial models and architectural solutions, such that any citizen or a group in Belgrade might be able to use it and figure out how to intervene in that instance. For the final event, we insisted that the event itself is not a review, but an event, and organize the space as a sort of a gallery itself. And then we invited our friends, formerly known as reviewers, to in fact occupy and join us through some of the devices that we had produced, such that they would have to meet us no longer as authorities on the topics and things that we have done, but as colleagues sort of in a sideways gaze. And so any conversation about the work was either more intimate than before, or involved a kind of reconstitution of that event of review as something entirely different. So the Collective Architecture Studio then went to Seoul, where we had friends playing our self-management game. And then some of the spirit of this work and the game itself also initiated the work on sharing trainers for the São Paulo Biennale this fall, last fall, 2019, which was titled The Everyday. And for this one, we started with two images. One of children in a three-legged race, running together, screaming in delight with their legs tied together, clumsy and fun. The success of any team in this game depends on arriving at some amount of coordination and cooperation. And the other was a picture painted by a folk tale, the allegory of long spoons. Some say that this story has religious origins. Others say that it starts with a kind of within or works within the Aesopian tradition of fables. But in any case, it is the image we like of people feeding each other with utensils whose length demands codependency. In all of its versions, the parable of the long spoons is deadly serious. It is about survival of the species, or of the lot at least. But when placed side by side with the kids in a three-legged race, one starts to get the mood of our project. So we propose to remake the everyday table setting such that a number of key elements require cooperation in the manner that the long spoons do. We propose to multiply forms of direct dependence across the party in order to foster kinship and delight, kinship in delight, and delight in kinship. And we packed it all up into 3 suitcases that we took to São Paulo, and then unpacked in that context, to including the seating, which, and this is the simplest of the seatings, but basically the seating as well relied on collaboration. And so we set up our picnic, and our friends at the Biennale performed this party for the opening, feeding each other, drinking together, and playing the game. And then we were sent also a set of images of people we didn't know who played the game during the time of the Biennale. So this takes us to the project that was called Playroom, which luckily we were able to open and in this year and close at the end of February, just before we were sent out of the building at MIT. And this project, very importantly, comes out of the class that, or not the class, but basically out of it collects student work on a series of different games that we produce together through different frameworks that I now think of as the Critical Broadcasting Lab sort of pedagogical extensions. One of them being the Precedents in Critical Practice, which is the first class that all of the MArch students have to take in history and theory. And here is a game that was Hélène produced for that class in its final review. And then here is Hélène in the gallery in our playroom. So I will give you a little more explanation of that, but we basically also studied the way in which the poker table and the campaign table was developed historically, and developed a series of pieces of furniture that would support our different games. So here is Hélène ultimately opening up onto that, the large table. And it was, of course, a discussion about, or a critical game that takes on some of the ways in which monopoly works, but it looked at the way in which gentrification occurs around Highline, with various sort of updates on monopoly to correspond with our current reality, including in this case, the card that is the Starchitect card, the chance cards that deal with contemporary cultural and political life of New York, and then a kind of transformation of monopoly to include building one's skyscraper and adding Starchitect facades onto it to transform the value. The values themselves were all based on the actual research of that gentrification process around Highline. And our different money was, of course, Starchitects who participated in the production of architecture around the Highline. It's eminently playable and fun, but also transmits through that play the kind of critical look at how architecture participates in gentrification processes. The second game that we included was a portfolio agency, which looked at various schools, or the spectrum of schools that support application to American schools, maybe elsewhere as well, but we have been encountering this in our admissions a lot, and our own students are quite sort of troubled by it. So this was a game that used chutes and ladders, which you might recognize to some extent in this board, to again talk one through various strategies and sort of obstacles that one might encounter, whether they have the money to go to a portfolio agency or not on their way to entering schools. And then importantly, we had a memory game that was called Discarded, which used the logic of the memory game, but it also insisted on including information that we tend to erase from architectural history. And so in that sense, we were working with Ananya Roy's idea about sanitized modernism, or the way in which we take out problematic histories from our canonical narratives of architecture. So here, for every piece of architecture, and you might recognize this one that was included, there were 3 cards, and you could read the text about them. One would be a statistical card, one would be the kind of celebratory card, and one would be the card that would talk about the human and other sort of environmental costs that these buildings had incurred in their production. So and you can recognize here the identity gamble also playing out. So for this particular set of, or this exhibition, we also organized play dates throughout the time that the exhibition was on, such that every week, one of the games or two of the games were highlighted, and the school was invited to play them such that we could, in the school, continue to have conversations about some of these very important topics. There is a project that Hélène also referred to. I would prefer not to, the famous sort of words of disengagement, or let's call it that, because that's what's important for this project. So this is an oral history that the Critical Broadcasting Lab has begun. And it is a kind of production or putting on record of production of an archive, or putting on the record of things that tend not to be recorded and therefore not spoken about. So there are two, I would prefer not to, questions that we ask every firm that we talk to. And of course we could talk to as many firms as there are about these topics. One is, what is the commission that they have refused, or a typology of commission they might have refused? And the other is there a kind of an instance in which they have chosen not to take another architect to court on architectural IP issues, the copying question? So what is important for us about this is that these are decisions made by architects to withdraw, to not engage. And because they are that, they don't tend to leave traces, and they don't become subject of our discussions about ethical choices that architects might have made, so, or not. But so what we're trying to do is collect as many of these as possible. And, you know, as you can see here, they were recorded on Skype before this COVID moment. So there was a notion that there was something really potentially interesting about this way of interfacing with architects, that we were seeing into their offices, and they're very, let's say, they are completely at ease with this kind of form of interviewing. But that's completely now problematic. We can't really show it anymore because everyone has seen into each other's offices, bedrooms, and elsewhere. So, but let me just give you a kind of a sense.
And Nishizawa said, can we make architecture, right? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if we can make architecture, it really doesn't matter what the ethics is, because time, you know, and ethics and morals, they change, but architecture is forever, and architecture is higher than any other moral value.
So you're getting a sense that's Florian Eidenberg. So
I will say that because the manual section had very specific way of drawing clouds and trees and line work, and I've seen drawings that replicate that's crossed the threshold from being just similarities of kind of aesthetics to specific forms, and that of course is easier to identify. And so, but yeah. So
that gives you a sense, that was Paul Lewis of LTL, gives you a sense of how these two questions sort of, or what they result in a way, as a record. So I'm going to stop here with just a flash of conversations on care that I cannot give you now in detail, but that is the project that we've been able to continue working on during COVID, now as a radio program, in which I invite different caretakers of architectural discourse to talk about what that caretaking involves and means. So I'm going to now stop the share and get back to you in this form.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna, for this wonderful foray through all the works that have been undertaken in advance of and through the Critical Broadcasting Lab. it occurs to me as I listen that there are a number of different directions we can take into your work, whether it's through this notion of operative criticism and critique, or whether it's through the particular attempts of leveling hierarchies in spaces of pedagogy, whether it's through the role of curation as it relates to architecture, or the importance of an architectural politics, whether it's ethics of care, whether it's an emphasis on storytelling or game playing, collective agency, questions of IP and the good and the bad copy. There are so many different angles we can take, which makes the body of work extraordinarily rich and also hard to know where exactly to begin. I'm no, it's like a sort of a bounty of topics that we can engage in. I think one thing that we might circle back to is this question of a return to questions of care. And I think you've got a particular formulation of this, in fact, around, especially with your last slides, how we speak of the caretaking of architectural discourse. Though, in fact, I think this brings us right back to the early manifesto that you outlined through your reading of George Saunders, about how we kind of perhaps turn our megaphones down, how we shift the register of our messages, and yet at the same time there's the challenge of being heard amidst all of the noise. So I wonder whether you could speak a little bit more around, the importance of this caretaking of architectural discourse and, the importance of these discursive interventions.
I mean, so maybe I'll just bring it back to the conversations on care, which really revolves around, or really is in every case a conversation, first of all, so that it's not about the kind of platform from which one speaks their own messages, but is in a position to co-produce a kind of a message, and therefore kind of through dialogue ensure that there is not an emphasis on their own work. And so for me, what's interesting about and important about conversations on care is that I am inviting curators and editors, people who tend to be taking care of platforms on which other people can speak. And so obviously they curate what kinds of messages occur there, but they are also doing that for a kind of for the sake of others in a way that I think is important. And we don't often talk about what is the labor that goes into that work. So when I talk to editors, for example, to Cynthia Davidson Brioni Roberts, whose log 48 just came out, one of the things I'm interested in is that sort of labor that is invisible. The labor of, in fact, editing, right? Like, what does that entail? Or when I was talking to Gia Gu, who is the director of materials and applications space in Los Angeles that has been putting up exhibitions and programs. What was interesting there is talking about how does one value monetarily within an NGO the work of architects. So there are sort of details of that labor that for me are important, again, to put on record. So I do think that a lot of the work for the Critical Broadcasting Lab, or the projects for me that become important, are those about ensuring that we have somewhere recorded the fact that there is labor that goes into this, and that tends not to be discussed or understood when we are encountering a magazine or an exhibition. And also something like the story, which I would prefer not to put on the record a decision that doesn't exist, basically because it was a decision to, or doesn't leave material traces because it was a decision to not engage. And yet that decision seems ethically so important for us to be able to consider. So these are, for me, some sites through which, or some ways in which I think care enters. And then there are more specific topics that were in a way sponsored by either the state of contemporary architectural academia, where the notion of having a collective architecture studio was, for me, important to try to in a way question how we frame the kind of ego of the genius architect, or can we question that and possibly transform how we might imagine sidestepping the market and so to go to a place where there's a history of doing that seemed like we could begin to think it again, to imagine a kind of world that we're not inhabiting in our daily life.
Yes.
I don't know if that answered your question.
No. Thank you very much. I think it also very much leads us to those spaces of pedagogy where you're undertaking a particular kind of care to alert architecture students to other ways of thinking through architecture. You know, whether it's the invisible labour, whether it's questions of, you know, intellectual property, you know, the good and the bad copy, how conscious we are of our precedents. And also it strikes me, you know, because precedents do play such a strong role in terms of architectural studio work, to note who your influences are and to be conscious of them, and to be conscious that in bringing in an influence to bear on your architectural project, you're bringing with it a whole ideology or image of thought. So the importance of all of that. But also I'm struck by these wonderful tools for collectivity that you've been exploring with your students. And also the games. And I was wondering whether you could speak a bit more to these strategies and these fantastic kind of tools and tactics.
I'm going to take off my jacket. So I do think, for me, one of the reasons why the lab is called Critical Broadcasting Lab, I do think of it as a kind of entity that is capable of producing curatorial work and interventions in discourse without the sort of the tools that are central to the discipline. So, but I call it a broadcasting lab and not a curatorial lab because I think we have different media for producing messages. And it turns out that the kind of the game as a medium for broadcasting is so much more engaging than sort of talking at someone about the same set of topics. So there's a kind of experience of that game that both is an experience in which information is transmitted, but it's melded with the experience of the particular instance of encountering it with a set of people that are again specific. So there's something about that mode of talking that I think I have found with the students who've been participating in this really productive. And so we did imagine also that some of these games would themselves be broadcasts that we can actually send to people, especially in this COVID moment. So the kind of lo-fi dimension of that broadcast, or the kind of super analog dimension of it, seems like a very important one to, or it seems, I don't know, it seems more capable of being effective in the moment when we are all scrolling and, you know, constantly seeing each other now through these mediated sort of interfaces. And similarly, actually, the fact that we started the radio at MIT, sort of a week into COVID homeschooling call, was sort of phenomenal, because it basically brought back an old format for talking to each other that allowed us to take a break from the kind of Zoom exhaustion that we are experiencing. And so there is a certain kind of simultaneity that radio allows, and there is a certain kind of oral collectivity, but it's decidedly not the one that we are experiencing in this moment.
No, and there's a lot to be said for the role of anachronism in all this, and a useful anachronism in a way, you know, the return of the board game amid COVID, and how people are playing board games through their Zoom accounts or other modes of listening so as to get over the screen exhaustion. So hence the radio, which is obviously so timely. And noticeably in a lot of these games and these tools and tactics, there seems to be a large stress on embodiment, you know, the way the collective garments bring us together into proximity. Of course, for COVID-19, you'll have to make sure there's a 1.5 meter distance and everything. But what about the role of embodiment here, which I don't know, I want to be wary of saying this, but it seems it has a bit of a feminist trajectory, as of course does an ethics of care.
I mean, I certainly, yes. I mean, I would subscribe to that reading of it very easily. And I don't know yet what to do with it, because I feel sort of pangs of nostalgia in this COVID moment about that, because very much true of both our sharing trainers and of the playroom. The kind of physical presence was really what made those sort of I don't want to say magical, but for me magical. It seems maybe a little narcissistic to propose that that's how they were experienced, but there was definitely a presence and an embodied presence. And so for me, maybe a place to I don't know if maybe I should take it there or not. But certainly in the case of the collective architecture studio, I do think that for me, it developed in part in conversation with someone like Bell Hooks, who talks about a very particular form of teaching in which presence, an embodied presence, and a kind of open and vulnerable presence is very important.
Absolutely. I see we have a question coming up here, more about games. So I'm just going to read out this question from Dasha. These games are such a fabulous pedagogical tool. Can you speak about ways in which they translate to multiple audiences connected to architectural practice? For example, in the Belgrade project, who else is using all this knowledge that was created? What did the other audiences think of that project? So that's a question from Dasha.
Yeah, so in the Belgrade context, we were very fortunate to encounter a series of activist groups in that environment that were, to me, very exciting, because they are kind of I think of it as the millennial activist generation that is tapped into a kind of maybe a cultural memory of what socialism was or might have been or could be, right? So in that case, they found some of our work exciting, but also probably a little bit naive. And still, I think we were able to importantly bridge from Belgrade to our context in the US. What we talked about as a collective at MIT was the extent to which we could use the platform, MIT as a platform, to speak back to the Belgrade context, having sort of, let's say, internalized some of the conversations we already had with the activists in that context. But now, could we access a kind of, through our privilege, access the kind of the political realm in Belgrade and maybe nudge it in the direction that that this sort of movement would like it to go. Now, we didn't do that yet, at least, but we were certainly hoping that we would send some of our work, the competition for the park, as well as some of the specific proposals that students made to that sort of decision-making bodies in that context. And then in the context of the US, I think what is really resonating were some of the ways in which I think we were able to at least question the practice of pedagogy. And so there was no question that that was something that that the students in the school understood and appreciated and wanted to see sort of as an experiment. And for me, it was really personally a really important experiment, because I had never put myself in a position where I didn't have the authority either, because the only way that the collective could have the power that it needed to have, the kind of space that it needed to have to develop decisions and methods and work, was by removing my authority.
Which is much easier said than done, of course. Being a pedagogical leader, it takes quite a lot of careful working through to develop that trust in a student cohort, I think, but really invaluable, because it's also the way in which we can really activate our students and their responses to us. Bartleby, I think, is many of our sort of personal favourites, and this formula, you know, I would prefer not to, which is such a powerful one, and very ambivalent too, because you can see how it can work in a number of ways, because disengagement both has its negative, you know, to become politically disengaged and to retreat, you know, potentially has a negative connotation, but as well, you know, I'd prefer not to as a moment of critical and creative resistance as well. And I'm struck again, I guess I'm really struck by this Saunders, you know, this ordinary party and the figure with the megaphone, whose language comes to infect all of the party attendees. And in a way, that's what happens with Bartleby, but at the other end of the spectrum. So through a kind of quiet insistence, his language too infects all those around him in the office. And of course, he's a copyist, which is really neat in terms of your interest in the copy. So, you know, so I'm just interested in that ambivalence here and how we work with it. Yeah, go on.
I mean, this is where, you know, I do think, for me, that Saunders story, of course, was existentially important, because as a curator and writer, you know, I do have a megaphone. As a teacher at MIT, I do have a megaphone. And I was about to produce a lab whose point was to speak, to broadcast positions. So for me, the key thing that he suggests, or the kind of resistance items that he gives us, the idea that when we speak, we must speak with precision, humanity, and recognize that the sort of volume at which we speak is also a matter of politics, seemed really important. So I think the point is not to not speak, but to figure out what is the way to intervene in that space such that things go for the better.
No, absolutely. We can only hope, especially at the current moment where it seems all the more urgent to find the best way of speaking amongst ourselves. I also want to go back to this this kind of work in Belgrade, and you know, the sort of cultural memory of a sort of socialist emphasis, and the comments you were making about Fukuyama, end of history, and Habermas, you know, setting the East on the right road, and think back on what lessons weren't learned and might be recaptured. I'm thinking about this too because I've just recently relocated from Sweden, which of course still has something of the social welfare state in operation, you know, with the good and the bad things around that, but it sits in a politically different situation than Australia, certainly, which has much more of the liberal democratic approach, and much more of the sort of also neoliberal agenda that creeps in amidst that. So given some of your work also in that context, and the workshops you've undertaken there and so forth, I was wondering, do you think there might be sort of lessons from a sort of socialist orientation that we can bring along with us? Certainly, I think an emphasis on you know, collective work comes in here, for instance.
I mean, absolutely. That's why, you know, I mean, it so happens that Belgrade is also my context. And so that helped that sort of embodied teaching dimension of that studio. But I certainly think that there are lessons to be learned from there. That, and specifically, I have studied the Eastern European context across the sort of geography of it. And it took me a while to understand the kind of specificity of the Yugoslavian model, which I think provides some things that were not equally present in some other parts of Eastern Europe. But what's important in this sort of moment of, you know, 20 years after the transition, or 30, is that we are seeing the kind of results of a very fast transition towards neoliberal capitalism. And it has left a lot of sort of carcasses of various kinds around it. So it is possible in that context, both to sort of see what that transformation has produced in a kind of an uglier way than I think we might see elsewhere, and to get a sense of the kind of memory of what was there once, the kind of the idea of social ownership. It's very hard to imagine that when you're sitting in the kind of in the US context, certainly, but a context in which things like education and healthcare were provided for everyone, and they were not state provided, they were socially owned. I mean, that's sort of, again, it's
an
not
important distinction, yeah. Which is a similar distinction in the Swedish context too, yeah.
I mean, so when we think of this from the Western context, generally there's an idea that there's a very powerful state that is deploying all of these things, and that's a horrible thing. And indeed, state and some of the sort of elements of government were quite problematic. Many things were problematic, but there were also a number of things that one could certainly wish for.
Certainly. Here. Education, health, and housing, for instance.
Yeah.
We have a question from Donald Bates. I take the notion of a lab as a site for experimentations, testing the production of new options and tactics. From the work of your lab and its successes and failures, are you more or less optimistic about the trajectory of your projects and their impact onto architecture? So that's a question from Donald Bates here.
I mean, I think that's a great, generous reading of the lab. In the context of MIT, everything is a lab. So unfortunately, this sort of formulation is not something we talk about in that context a lot, but I certainly think of it as testing and producing new options and tactics. And there are certain things that I am optimistic about. I wasn't very optimistic until really these protests started in the US in more general sense. But I do think that our collective architecture studio and the way in which we transformed everything about teaching in that semester has a future. I think there's, so that on one end, and the kind of, that really, I think maybe most importantly, the idea that we were able to rethink authorship within studio as well as authority in studio. Both of those, I think, are very important for the discipline to think about, and there are trajectories along which I think transformations that we might call some form of decolonization of the curriculum and of the discipline might take, right? I also thought, I am excited about the games, but I don't know if I don't know yet if I could talk about it as a success or a failure. I am going to think about that a little bit more as I...
Oh no, for sure. Monopoly, though I'm always at horror of playing Monopoly, but Monopoly with our boys has become an interesting exercise because I often come in as the anti-gentrifier with the aim of attempting to buy up a plot across all the range of properties, which means you can't build hotels or houses. And everyone gets very frustrated because I become the killjoy. I destroy the logic of the game by attempting to, slow down development. And so you see all these ways in which a spanner can be thrown in the works of a game, the game can be disrupted, and these become powerful critical tools. But I wonder also whether we can come back to this powerful notion of criticism, criticality, the critic, to be critical, and the kind of operative criticism that it seems the critical broadcasting lab is forwarding here, and how critical doesn't have to be a kind of even necessarily a deconstructive gesture, but something that is constructive. I wonder whether you could speak more to
maybe that also goes back to this sort of new options and tactics that Donald's asking.
Yeah.
I do think that in our context, criticism, even though we have HTC, we have a C in that sort of name, it isn't cultivated the same way. And it turns out that a lot of our design students certainly are hungry for different modes of operating architecture and in discourse. And there are certainly topics that I think are political and important, and as I said, don't have immediate sort of instrumentalizable paths into design and architecture. So what the Critical Broadcasting Lab allows for students and myself and sort of the lab participants is a way to grapple with questions that eventually have something to do with architecture, or that they have something to do with the kind of, so there's both a kind of trajectory for them to affect the discipline once we figure them out, but there's also a way to say this is the discipline. The discipline requires us to think in these ways as well. So this is why when I was starting, I said, you know, that some of this work perhaps is not at the center of the discipline as we have seen it, and yet I think the center has to move. We are all, I think, aware of it, and certainly in this moment. And so
I couldn't agree with you more. It's the challenge of reformulating the discipline.
Yeah. And also there's a kind of, there are different temporalities that run through a school at any given moment. Some of them are about the political urgency that is knocking at our door. Some of them are about, you know, how one becomes a professional in architecture. It's a very different sort of timeline. And I think the Critical Broadcasting Lab allows that space for immediate sort of research and positioning that is very important for the discipline, I think.
I have another question here from Sarah Hobday North. Does architecture just need to be more playful and take itself a little less seriously? ? Can we be less serious within our own profession and still be taken seriously by an architecture skeptical public? Would that be a good outcome? So a question from Sarah Hobday North.
Well, you know, I love the idea of playful, but I'm also quite, you know, some of the topics are deadly serious. So I think we need both, and in some sort of dialogue or ratio that allows us to discuss them, right? So I feel like there are certain things within the discipline that I would be very happy if we became a little more lighthearted about. And yet there are certain questions that I feel like we must take very seriously. And if playfulness is necessary for us to be able to transmit to those architecture skeptics their seriousness, then by all means, we should be playfully serious.
Absolutely. I think at that point we should probably slowly draw to a close, Anna. And Sarah says thank you for your answer, by the way. I just really want to thank you for the really generous introduction to the Critical Broadcasting Lab. I just want to come there and join you and be a student all over again. I think this is something about what it means
just
to be
a collaborator.
Yeah, a collaborator, absolutely.
Yes, yeah.
It's really wonderful to just hear about such inspiring approaches to a rethinking of architecture as a discipline. So thank you again, Anna. Thanks so much for joining us. Now I'm just going to, before our audience leaves us, I'm just going to share our screen. So just a plug for next week. We have Reinhold Martin joining us at MSD at Home, same time, 12 p.m. Reinhold is a professor of architecture at Columbia Graduate School and also involved in the Temple Hohen-Buell Center, which is currently looking at issues of power and infrastructure, and has previously also looked very closely at the relationship between architecture and property. And I think in some ways we'll be returning to some of the themes that we ventured today, which will be great. So please look out for that session, that talk next week. And finally, just to let you know that MSD at Home is accessible via YouTube. And if you want to catch any of the lectures and conversations and dialogues that you've missed over the last several weeks, here is the link that you have available for you. I just want to thank you all, our audience, and again, Anna, for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you again about this time next week. Thank you very much.